What were taverns like in the Middle Ages? Well, if you're expecting a cozy place with flickering candlelight, soft bards music playing in the background, and people toasting with elegance, think again. The stench hit you like an invisible fist the moment you crossed the threshold of a medieval tavern. A thick mixture of rancid sweat, rotting wood, dried vomit, and beer that had been fermenting for days, all wrapped in a blanket of smoke that made your eyes water. Nothing like those cozy inns shown in movies, with their cheerful bartenders and bright beer served in gleaming mugs. The real medieval tavern was a brutal assault on the senses, a space where filth, noise and violence coexisted under low ceilings blackened by soot. The floor, always sticky, was covered with rushes that were never changed. New ones were simply added on top when the smell became unbearable even by medieval standards. The lighting, barely a few smoking candles, was just enough to hide the dirt and sometimes the crimes. The furniture wasn't designed for comfort. Simple planks over barrels served as tables, unstable three-legged benches that creaked under the weight of customers, and everything designed not for comfort, but to withstand the blows from frequent fights. Follow me and hit like if you want to discover more secrets about these fascinating medieval dives. Medieval taverns weren't simply places to drink. They functioned as the true beating heart of society, a meeting point where lives from all social classes intersected. Laborers and carpenters would spend up to half their weekly wages seeking warmth and forgetfulness in liquid form. Merchants closed important deals while sharing a jug. Clerics who, despite their sermons against vice, were known for their appetite for drink. Knights and soldiers who could maintain order or provoke absolute chaos depending on their mood. Even women had their space, whether working as servers, managing the business as widows, or more rarely, as customers. For the medieval traveler, the tavern was much more than a place to rest. It was a crucial information center, where one learned about road news, dangers lurking ahead, or whether the bridge over the river was still standing after the latest rains. It's no coincidence that some governments paid informants to pretend to be simple drunks, capturing valuable conversations amid the general hubbub. The medieval tavern was a node in the communication network of the time, as important as it was dangerous. If you thought you'd find good food in these establishments, reality would have deeply disappointed you. The typical menu revolved around pottage, a thick stew where literally everything at hand was thrown in. The same pot could be boiling for days. Today a bit of turnip might be added, tomorrow perhaps a piece of questionable meat. And speaking of meat, its origin was so dubious that in London, in 1444, selling suspicious meat in taverns was banned after neighborhood pets started disappearing. The result? They continued selling it, but with greater discretion. The famous meat pies, colloquially known as coffins, contained fillings of uncertain nature, wrapped in thick, heavy dough. The bread, dark and hard, served more as a plate than as food, used to absorb sauces before being given to the poor or to pigs. Cheese was another relatively safe option, although sometimes its hardness challenged even the most resistant dentures. I'd love to know your opinion about these medieval delicacies. Don't forget to follow me and like if you're enjoying this journey to the most authentic past. Regarding drinks, beer reigned supreme in the medieval tavern. Don't imagine anything like what we drink today. It was a cloudy beverage with little alcoholic content and no carbonation, but much safer than the water of the time. It was brewed on the same premises or by neighboring brewers and had to be consumed quickly, as it spoiled within days. Wine, mead or cider were also served, depending on the region, while water was almost completely avoided due to its danger. The medieval medical advice was clear: better risk drunkenness than cholera. Cheating in beverage sales was common currency. Diluting beer with water was a common practice, although if you were caught, you could end up in jail or subjected to public humiliation. The shrewdest tavern keepers charged different prices based on the customer's appearance. A well-dressed merchant might pay double what a peasant would for exactly the same beer. It was an economy based on appearance and cunning, where deception was part of the business. Despite the questionable food and adulterated drink, medieval taverns were never empty. The reason was simple. They offered what was most scarce in the Middle Ages: entertainment. Dice games dominated the scene, especially hazard, the direct ancestor of today's craps. Needless to say, the dice were frequently rigged. The house always won, even in the 14th century. Those more skilled with games could make a living cheating inebriated novices who didn't realize they were being duped until it was too late. For those not attracted to board games, there were improvised competitions, lifting barrels, drinking more than your neighbor, or simply staying conscious longer than the rest. Everything was a valid reason to bet your last coin, or failing that, the boots you were wearing. Music also had its sacred space. Itinerant troubadours performed in exchange for food and lodging, some with real talent, others simply shouting loud enough to be heard above the general din. Dancing in taverns had little to do with refined, courtly movements. Here people jumped, pushed and sweated in an unleashed physical expression that the church vehemently condemned, which only made it more attractive to the general public. And then there were what we might call additional services. Although prostitution was technically illegal, many taverns offered companionship in exchange for an established price. As long as they didn't cause major scandals, authorities preferred to look the other way, considering it a necessary evil to maintain certain social peace. With such an explosive mixture of alcohol, testosterone, and betting, fights were not the exception, but the norm in the medieval tavern. Being attacked with shots didn't mean receiving gunfire, but having jugs thrown at your head and ending up on the bench referred to receiving a beating with one of the seats. Weapons were theoretically prohibited, but any object could become a lethal weapon in the right hands. Glasses, plates, chicken bones, and even wooden spoons. What's surprising is that amid this apparent chaos, strict rules existed that tried to maintain some order. Urban authorities imposed curfews. In cities like London, bells rang at 9 at night in summer and 8 in winter, signaling the theoretical moment when everyone should leave. Of course, the reality was that the best moments of the night were just beginning with the curfew. There were also limits on the amount of beer that could be served to the same person. An English king went so far as to decree that no one should receive more than a penny's worth of beer per night. The ingenious solution of drinkers: make an endless round from tavern to tavern. Upon entering a tavern, theoretically you had to surrender your weapons, which were kept behind the counter until your departure. This system worked halfway, and it just took a misinterpreted look or an offensive word for stools and jugs to fly through the air. Prices were officially regulated, with municipal inspectors checking the quality and cost of beer using peculiar methods. They would sit on benches smeared with beer, and if their clothes stuck when they got up, it meant the drink had too much sugar or honey. A primitive but surprisingly effective method. To legally open a tavern, an official license was needed. In England, this was signaled by hanging a beer stake outside, indicating that the establishment had the necessary permits. However, many places operated without a license, especially in dark alleys where uncomfortable questions were conspicuously absent. Security wasn't handled by polite doormen, but by genuine professional thugs. If you refused to pay or caused too many problems, you weren't met with a reasonable conversation, but with a solid blow from a club, and if you were lucky, you were only thrown onto the street without further damage. Punishments for misconduct in taverns could be creatively humiliating, from shouting your name and offense at the door of the establishment to forcing you to parade through town inside a barrel with holes for your arms. Public shame worked as a deterrent in a society where reputation was everything. The medieval tavern operated as controlled anarchy, a space where law existed but was applied selectively, according to convenience and interests. One of the biggest challenges for the tavern economy was the payment system, considering that most medieval customers didn't carry coins. Ingenuity made up for the lack of cash. Barter was the most common method, with blacksmiths sharpening the tavern keeper's knives in exchange for a few mugs, or shoemakers delivering a pair of sandals for a bowl of pottage and a place by the fire. In just 3 months, a medium-sized tavern could accumulate as payment gloves, eggs, fabrics, and even live animals. For regular customers with nothing to offer at the moment, there was the tally stick system, an ingenious precursor to our modern credit cards. It consisted of a wooden stick that was split lengthwise. The tavern keeper kept one half and the customer the other. Each drink consumed was marked with a notch on both halves. When the time came to settle the debt, both parts were joined, and if the notches matched, the debt was considered legitimate. A tamper-proof system in an era without digital records, there was also reputation-based credit. If you were a regular customer known for keeping your word, you could drink now and pay when you had the means. However, if you failed to meet your commitment, your name could end up on the dreaded wall of shame or be shouted every night by the tavern keeper until you settled your debt. Some left personal items as collateral, cloaks, knives, or work tools that the tavern keeper would sell if you didn't return to pay. A tradition that has survived to this day is the famous round. Buying a round of drinks for everyone wasn't just a gesture of generosity, but an inescapable social obligation. If you couldn't pay when your turn came, you risked being excluded from the group and labeled as stingy or opportunistic, a social tag difficult to remove. Foreigners, for their part, had to pay in advance, with no possibility of opening accounts until they earned the trust of the establishment. Behind all this apparent chaos worked a human team that kept the tavern running against all odds. The tavern keeper wasn't simply a beer server, but a multifaceted entrepreneur who acted as conflict mediator, doorman, improvised psychologist, and, sometimes inevitably, as a human punching bag. They needed to remember debts without keeping written records, calm excited spirits, resolve disputes before they escalated, and physically survive the process. A tavern keeper from Bristol, according to historical records, ended up with 3 broken ribs and a fractured hand in just 1 year of work. These professionals developed a sixth sense for reading the environment, strategically separating potentially problematic customers using secret signals among staff, like touching their ear to indicate watering down the drink of someone particularly troublesome, and making instant decisions about who could enter, who should leave, and how much to charge based on the customer's face. Some respected tavern keepers even resolved minor legal disputes to prevent them from reaching official courts, acting as unofficial justices of the peace in their small kingdoms of chaos. Medieval waitresses were the true unsung heroines of the system. Young, necessarily strong, and with a prodigious memory, they had to carry several heavy jugs through drunken crowds, remember complex orders without writing them down, literacy wasn't common, distinguish between dangerous and generous customers, and survive constant harassment without losing their composure or professional smile. Their social position was extremely vulnerable. Many ended up in courts defending their honor after being falsely accused of prostitution simply for serving beer with kindness. They worked for minimum wages, sometimes only in exchange for food and a bed in the ramshackle attic of the establishment, but maintained the frantic pace night after night. Historical records barely mention their names, but without them, the institution of the tavern simply wouldn't have functioned. They endured endless shifts, constant verbal abuse, and exhausting physical conditions without the labor protections we take for granted today. In the kitchens operated the cooks, true alchemists of the edible, who transformed dubious ingredients into dishes that at least didn't kill instantly. They worked in spaces filled with suffocating smoke, extreme heat, and surrounded by food in various states of decomposition. Their arsenal included strong spices to disguise suspicious odors, creativity to invent dishes with what was available, and ladles that served both to stir the pottage and to threaten impatient servers demanding faster service. The security personnel, euphemistically called tavern guards, were in reality professional thugs hired to maintain a certain order through physical intimidation and, when necessary, direct violence. They didn't politely ask you to behave. They literally made you fly through the door if you caused problems. Despite the harshness of their methods, they were an essential part of the balance that allowed these establishments to function in times where formal law had limited reach. Curiously, despite the harsh working conditions and constant exposure to dangerous situations, the staff of medieval taverns formed remarkably united communities. They protected each other, took care of each other during illnesses or injuries, and occasionally took coordinated revenge on particularly abusive customers by serving them beer from the bottom of the barrel or something worse that perhaps is better not to detail. For a medieval traveler, correctly choosing a tavern wasn't a trivial decision, but potentially a matter of life or death. The most experienced sought recommendations among trusted merchants or pilgrims who had traveled the same route. There were informal lists transmitted orally about safe establishments and warnings about others, where guests had the unfortunate tendency to disappear during the night along with all their belongings, or worse still, to appear floating in the nearby river days later. External signs could offer valuable clues about the nature of the establishment. A well-maintained sign, solid doors with good locks, the presence of women or local artisans as regular customers usually indicated a relatively respectable and safe place. In contrast, a neglected exterior, silent men with shifty eyes who intently observed newcomers or poorly cleaned bloodstains were red flags that any sensible traveler knew to interpret as signals to continue on their way without stopping. Even the state of the stables could be revealing. A place that properly cared for horses and baggage would probably also show some consideration for the physical integrity of its human customers. Harbour taverns had a particularly bad reputation for frequent disappearances, while establishments run by monasteries, although offering basic accommodation and food, at least guaranteed certain physical, if not spiritual, safety. Some prudent travelers preferred to avoid taverns completely, using instead letters of recommendation to stay in private homes of respectable people. Those who did venture into taverns of dubious reputation took elementary precautions, sleeping fully clothed, including footwear to facilitate a quick escape, hiding valuables in unsuspected places, blocking the room door with furniture, or even traveling with a dog trained to bark fiercely at the approach of strangers during the night. With the passing of centuries, these institutions gradually evolved. The discovery of hops as a natural preservative allowed beer to be brewed that remained in good condition for longer periods, revolutionizing the production and distribution of the most popular drink. Tavern architecture also experienced significant improvements. Efficient chimneys were added that reduced indoor smoke, larger windows that allowed natural light to enter, separate rooms for sleeping instead of simple pallets on the common floor, and better general sanitary conditions, although this latter concept would remain quite relative for centuries. Regulations also progressively hardened. Stricter official licenses appeared, more effective price controls, more severely monitored weapons bans, more rigorously controlled hours, and more substantial fines for offenders. What began as a space of almost anarchic freedom was gradually domesticated under the growing weight of state regulations, while always maintaining that spirit of social escapism that characterized them. It's fascinating to think that many of our current social customs have their direct roots in medieval taverns. From the act of toasting, originally a gesture to demonstrate that the drink wasn't poisoned, to the arrangement of tables and bars in our modern establishments. Although we now enjoy electric lighting, digital menus, and strict hygiene standards, the essential heart remains surprisingly similar, a space where we temporarily disconnect from our daily responsibilities to connect with other human beings, sharing drink, conversation, and that universal feeling of camaraderie that transcends times and cultures. The next time you enter a modern bar, try to imagine what that same experience would have been like 800 years ago, without electric light, without refrigeration, without modern concepts of hygiene, but with the same fundamental human need for socialization, escape, and belonging. Perhaps you would find that, under the layers of technology and refinement, we continue to seek essentially the same thing that our medieval ancestors sought when they pushed open the heavy wooden door of the local tavern after a long day's work. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the bowels of the authentic medieval tavern, so far removed from the romanticized versions we see in film and television. If you've enjoyed discovering the raw and fascinating reality of these fundamental spaces in medieval life, don't forget to follow me and leave your like. I'd love to read in the comments which aspect of medieval tavern life has surprised you the most. The dubious food, the ingenious payment methods, or perhaps the peculiar ways of maintaining order. Your opinion is important to continue exploring together the lesser-known corners of history.